Hey there, and welcome to episode 4 in our Fear, Love, and Creativity podcast series. Today, we have our second interview with a special guest in this series, the wonderful Bob Burg. Now, Bob has turned over in the past few years. He's been on a number of my podcasts. He's turned into an unofficial mentor, one of my very favorite authors, and a good friend. Now, for over 30 years, Bob has been working with entrepreneurs, leaders, sales professionals to help them build a business of more referrals and how to communicate their influence more effectively. Of course, he wrote the seminal book, Endless Referrals, and he's co-author, along with John David Mann, of the Go-Giver series of books. If you haven't read this series of books, highly recommend checking it out. They've sold over 1 million copies. Now, Bob is also a much sought after. He's a Hall of Fame keynote speaker. We're honored to have him here on this series today. Of course, we talk about that fear, love, and creativity theme, but Bob is really a calming influence amidst the storm of everything that's going on in the world right now. We talk about that, how he remains above the fray, and how he stays focused on persuasion and influence, what that means, rather than getting angry and allowing that fear porn to get under his skin. And by doing that, he provides value to millions of people through his work, through his writings, and through his influence. Without further ado, here's my full interview with Bob Burg.
And so this podcast, just as a quick intro, we're really exploring decision making, and when you make these decisions out of fear, or with a sense of love and compassion, and how that can impact our creative decisions, conflicts, our interpersonal relationships, and really thinking, honing in. One of the reasons I was really thinking about this is, in your books, you talk about the importance of breathing, kind of taking that step back and looking at the situation, not only for interpersonal relationships, conflict, but making better decisions, kind of avoiding adversity where it doesn't need to be avoided. And so that's the quick background of today, if you're good with that. So wonderful. I'll do an intro later so we can jump right in. And well, Bob, thank you so much for joining us today. I know you've been on my previous podcasts, and I am a student of your books, as well as my 15-year-old daughter is. She's been going through Adversaries into Allies, and the purpose of this podcast is really to look at when we make decisions and we're in a state of fear. We've seen a lot of that. And I think social media fans the flames. We've seen that over the last year and a half. Or out of a sense of love. And when I say love, I don't necessarily mean kissy and all that, but with a sense of love, compassion, and how that affects our ability to think creatively, which is not only painting and art and writing, but also creative decisions in terms of our interpersonal relationships and how we behave. So I really want to thank you for coming on this podcast.
Oh, it's my absolute pleasure. Thank you. I'm a fan of your work as well, which you've been on my podcast, and I love your book and the work you do and what you stand for.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. And looking at fear, and when I mentioned on LinkedIn that we were going to be doing this podcast, someone said, well, what are some examples in history of fear-based decisions? And now some of this, I readily agree. Some people will say, well, no, that wasn't based out of fear. I mean, I mentioned everything from the Holocaust to the Japanese internment to a number of things. And I have a fear of heights going back to when I was a kid. And what I notice is, and I had Randy Gage, spoke to him 2 weeks ago. And we talked about fear as kind of conditioning in our brains. And my wife and I, when we go hiking, we'll go up and high. You can, as we tape this, you can see one of these red rock hills behind me. We're trying not to instill fear with our kids. And so we say things like, pay attention instead of be careful, be careful. Right. And one of the things I notice as we talk about that, I don't want them to have that fear, is my mom saying things like, we're talking, hey, we're going to go to the Grand Canyon. Oh my gosh, watch those kids, be careful. And it dawns on me, wow, there's probably some programming in there. But when you're up high, I notice, when you're gripped with fear, you're tense, you're rigid, right? You have that fight, flight, or freeze, and you kind of become useless. And you're more dangerous to yourself on a cliff when you really should be a little kind of going with the flow. But one of the things as I think about that is you talk about in your books the importance, and now this is certainly with interpersonal relationships, of taking a deep breath and yielding. And I think we spoke on the last one. I said, I see a lot of Lao Tzu in the Go-Giver books, but certainly in Adversary into Allies, and the importance of yielding. Can you explain that more about taking a deep breath? Our parents said count to 10. Why that's difficult to do, and why that can help us think a little more creatively when we take that deep breath in interactions with others.
Well, it's difficult to do because you have to be conscious of it. We breathe all the time, right? I mean, it's just so natural. It's like the fish who, that doesn't know it lives in water. So we're breathing, and we have the air, this wonderful, beautiful, amazing air all around us. It sustains our lives. And yet, how often do we really think about that? Do we think, wow, I'm bringing it. In fact, the only time we don't is when we're short of breath, right? When something comes up that we're, when we need the breath, that's the only time we really think about it. Unless you stay conscious of it, and I think that's the thing. And so when there's an issue, a situation that could be uncomfortable, could be scary, could be, what have you, that's the time when we really need to be conscious of that air and of that breath. If we're conscious of it, we start to we see ourselves, we notice ourselves going, which is the unhealthiest, type of breathing. And decisions are much more likely to not be the best decisions when we're in that state.
Yeah.
So when we can think about it, say, okay, well, let's take a breath. Let's breathe in that air. Let's breathe in. Let's breathe out. Let's think about it. Let's be in control of ourselves. Let's be in control of our emotions. And it doesn't mean the fear isn't there if it's a legitimate. Some fears are legitimate. Most aren't, but some are. Regardless, when we're aware of that fear and aware of where our shallow breathing is taking us, now we're in a position to be able to do something about it.
One of the things I enjoyed about, there were a number of things I enjoyed about Adversaries into Allies, was that the Go-Giver books are fictional parables.
Mm-hmm.
With people they're based on, right? That I've heard stories and legends of who various people are based on in the books. Adversaries into Allies really gives a glimpse into you and some of your, and you're very humble in the book. I mean, you're humble anyways, but you're humble in the book, talking about some of the difficulties you've had, maybe in breathing or jumping in and interrupting people.
Oh,
when I follow you on Twitter and LinkedIn, it's interesting because I know, for instance, you are a defender and a supporter of liberty and free markets.
Mm-hmm.
I've seen you get kind of, was it last year? Someone tried to cancel you because of something you said. You were talking about coming together. I think it was on a Michelle Obama post, and someone tried to cancel you over that and said, I'm never getting your book again.
Right. Oh, that's right. Yes. And you came in and said, well, I'll buy 5 of them or something like that.
Yeah. And I bought a bunch of the books and gave them to my clients.
Yeah, that was so.
But then also, I can only assume that over the past year and a half, there are things that probably get under your craw, like drive you nuts when it relates to liberty and free markets and things going on in the world. However, when I look at your content, when I see you on podcasts, I mean, you're popping up constantly on my LinkedIn feed, being on people's podcasts. It's steady. You don't allow people to rock the boat in an age when, I run hot, right? And it's like, I want to get in there. How do you avoid allowing that kind of anger culture to get under you, but also kind of remain focused, where you talk about free markets and talk about liberty, but like, unlike me, you don't get drawn into the, what the hell is going on in the world? How can they do this? You have a very calming influence on others, not only in your books, but on social media. But how do you remain kind of above the fray, still use social media without getting drawn into the kind of fear pornography that's out there?
Yeah. And there certainly is fear pornography. That's a great way to put it. I also have other areas in which I have very strong feelings. Animal, as for animal
Right.
rights, I'm, a big believer in that. When I see, pictures of people ruthlessly stalking and hunting and killing and posing with their thing, just, my blood boils. But, I learned long ago, Curt, that it just, my goal is not just to speak my mind. My goal is to influence and to
Mhm.
persuade. Okay, not to manipulate, which is the negative form of
Mhm.
influence, but to persuade, which is the positive form. And I want what I say or when I engage with people, I want that to eventually, hopefully, turn into a person uh changing their thought process or adjusting their thought process or doing something differently than they may now. That's what persuasion is. That's what influence is. But it doesn't happen through getting angry, through getting
Mhm.
mad. It just doesn't. And I know people think it does, and I think they think it does because they want to think it does, because
Yeah.
it allows them the excuse to just kind of let people have it. But here's the thing. I have never seen a person who was lambasted on a tweet or some kind of post who was told, "You are a horrible human being. You're a monster. You're this, you're that, you're stupid, you're blah, blah." Never heard or seen that happen where the person who's attacked posts or tweets back something like, "Wow, you're right. I hadn't thought of it that way. But now that you mention it, yeah, I can see where I am totally wrong. I am just changing my opinion right now, and I agree totally with you." Never seen it happen,
Yeah.
because that's not how people are. If you yell at people, if you insult people, if you disparage people, they're not going to change. They're going to stay just as committed, if not more so, than they already were.
Mhm.
Now, understand, please, that this took me a long time to get to that to get to that point. I mean, as I admitted in Adversaries into Allies, I used to have just horrible anger issues and just hold grudges big time. And the poison that was in my system, the self-inflicted poison, was
Mhm.
was terrible. So at a certain point in my life, I went to work on myself. And I really took some of the real negative characteristics and traits and habits and so forth I had, and I turned them into strengths. um, I did this through studying one of the chapters in Benjamin Franklin's book, The Autobiography, where he talked about, uh, what he called perfecting, your character, perfecting your trait. Well, you don't get it perfect, but you try your best.
Right. Right.
It
Yeah.
certainly puts you, 9 steps ahead of where you were. So, but so it was a conscious change. And so, when I hear people or when I see people say things, when it comes to their misinterpretation of liberty or free markets or something, and they say something that's just so very incorrect, and they really think it's correct. And, is it going to do any good? I have to ask myself the question: is it really going to do any good to tell this person that they're wrong and that they're this or that, or is it going to do a little better to say, I appreciate the passion you have for this topic, and how much you obviously care about others. Like you, I want to live in a world where everyone's able to blah 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 blah. You know, and then in the next tweet, I can say, I think our biggest point of disagreement is the best, most effective way to get there. You
Yeah.
know, and so when you do that, now a person that kind of, first of all, it reframes the whole thing, right?
Yeah.
And now a couple things happen. One is, hopefully this person is going to say, "Oh well, I hadn't thought of that." What but what? How can you blah blah? Now you're in a discussion. Sometimes that's going to happen, but even if it doesn't, it's okay, because remember, there are usually many people watching that conversation. They're observing without saying anything, and they're listening for two things. One is, and these are the people, a lot of them, who aren't so far one way or so far another way. They're not so far to the left or so far to the right that their mind's made up. Don't confuse me with the facts. These are people who might be open to ideas if they hear them correctly, right?
Mhm.
So the people who are lurking are listening for two things. One, who makes the most logical sense? Okay. But that's probably secondary. Okay, because people don't operate or make decisions based on logic, or at least not logic alone. The most important thing they're hearing first, for the sake of persuasion, is who's more relatable, who sounds more, who comes across more as somebody who I would trust. Right? Is it the person who's insulting the person and calling them a monster because they don't believe what they believe, or that they, or is it the person who appreciates and compliments and says, and can genuinely say, I appreciate where you're coming from. And, I like you, I want to boom, 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 the biggest thing. Now it's, oh, okay, well, this person kind of makes sense. I want to know more. And these are the comments I'll get. They might be direct messages. There's people who may not answer that way publicly because they're afraid of being canceled. And so, yeah, I mean, I think that's really where it's at, Curt. I think it's understanding why it's important to be that way, and then willing to, to work on oneself to the point that you're able to communicate more constructively.
The Changsa, the other Taoist writer, who I've heard it called the Mark Twain of Taoism, he talks about the importance and the strength of a valley versus a mountain, right? And like right here, it's green. We're in the desert. It hasn't rained in a month. Actually, it rained today for the first time in like over a month. We have wildfires, but here in the valley, you have greenery, right? And the strength. And he talks about the strength of the valley versus the mountains because that's where everything runs into. And when I read that, I think of the go-giver in terms of attracting people. And you talk about that pull versus the push.
Right.
From a very practical standpoint, not just COVID and everything, but from a business standpoint, it can be, and many business owners are impatient. And sometimes you have a bad month, you have a bad year, you're starting out, maybe things aren't going well, and that fear starts building up. And instead of acting out of love and focusing on your clients and your wants, you want to start generating, it's like baseball, right? We're not hitting the ball, we got to generate runs. And so you got to do whatever it is.
Right.
What advice do you have for a business owner who starts getting that, right? Because everyone, as our friend Joe Peachy says, some months you're the foot and some months you're the ball, right? How do you get past that when I still have to pull people toward me, but you feel that fear, I got a mortgage to pay, I got kids, I got to do this. How do you bring it down a little bit to remain focused, kind of psychologically, physiologically on that pull instead of the push?
Yeah. So one thing I think is important is to immediately come back to the realization that nobody's going to buy from you because you have a mortgage payment to pay. Okay. So, so if you feel like you're operating out of fear, recognize that that's going to come across to those you're trying to deal with, that you're wanting to connect with, and they're going to be much less likely to buy from you, to do business with you. And so what we've got to say is, okay, what's going to be the best thing here for me to do? This goes back to the Stoic philosophy of, and a Buddhist philosophy, really, that all misery is caused by attachment, right? And what the Stoics taught, which I love in their teaching, is to recognize what you can't control. Absolutely, of course, we have to deal in truths, recognize what you can't control, but don't be attached to what you can't control. You need to focus on what you can control. Okay. So when we're in that situation where it's been a little rough and we've got to get back and we've got to start, getting some income in, and understand the only way we're going to get that income coming in is by providing value to others that they choose to receive and exchange their money for it. Okay. So it's always going to have to be about the other person. So what can we do? Okay. We can take our focus off ourselves. Now, that doesn't mean we're not self-interested. Okay. We're human beings. So what we need to do is, again, let's live in truth. Let's not deny our self-interest, but let's put it aside. That we can control. Let's temporarily suspend it. Just like when you go to watch a movie, you temporarily suspend your disbelief, right? You know that what's on the screen isn't real. Bruce Willis isn't cracking a joke when a terrorist has a gun pointed at his head. You know that, right? But in order to feel the feelings and enjoy the program and get the, we suspend our disbelief. But after the show's over, we walk back out and we get into the real world again. Well, temporarily suspend your self-interest and focus entirely on that other person or on the marketplace you're serving. To the degree you do that, now you're creating that environment where you are much more likely to have that sale happen. And now you're going to be back in business, and now things are going to start to cook for you.
Yeah, I love that. And some of it goes back to, I do a lot of breath work and taking those deep breaths so that when I do feel that fear in the mortgage, I have to get back in that abundance mindset. Otherwise I start, Larry, I don't know if you know Larry Levine, selling from the heart, and he calls it commission breath, that when you start getting desperate and you start operating out of fear, you really get that.
Yeah.
This is related to that, but you and I are both Atlas Shrugged, at least fans, or at least have read it.
Yeah.
No,
I love the book.
And it's interesting, as an aside, looking over the last year, and I was thinking, the news of the shortages going on in the world, and I'm like, oh my gosh, this is Atlas Shrugged. It was a nonfiction book, in that book, obviously they picked up, they went on strike, they went to Gulch, and they found their own society, right? And in our world, though, as those things start happening, and you mentioned some things, whether it's liberty, free markets, but also animal cruelty and protecting animals, and you get involved with certain things, right, related to that. At what point? Well, maybe that's not the best way to ask it. If the world is crumbling around you and there are threats that are out there, and right now, everyone's got strong feelings on vax, no vax, this and that, and everyone's there. At what point does something become a clear and present danger versus, hey, I'm focused on building my business, I'm focused on providing my value? At what point are the barbarians at the gate that you got to turn it and take action? And where's that fine line?
That's a great question, because you don't know where that fine line is. I think relatively few people do. And so often the people who you think should be the watch guards and the guardians of such, I don't know if they know, because they don't want to know.
Yeah.
So, there's many, there are many documentations of the fact that in certain ways we live at the best time ever, in which we have technology that connects us, technology that can cure a lot of things, that there are that the overall consciousness of humanity is getting better and higher, and yet there's so many really, really horrible things out there. I suspect that we don't hear a lot about much of the good that's going on, because a lot of the good is not newsworthy. Again, it doesn't draw the eyeballs into all the awful things going on, and there are plenty of awful things going on. So, how do you know? I don't know if you do, Curt, but I think what we all need to do is just stay as conscious as we can and look around. Be careful not to believe the conspiracy theories because we want to, because it's the right side of the aisle saying it, but continually, and Randy Gage probably said this, continue to check your premises.
Yeah.
Right. And always ask why, question why. So yeah, I do think we need to be vigilant. I don't think it's something we can ever just say, oh no, the government's going to take care of us. No, the government's probably, their ineptness and is probably going to allow a lot of the harm to happen. I'm reading right now Carol Roth's new book. It's called The War on Small Business.
Oh, I've seen that. Yes.
Yeah. Now, the subtitle is, how the government used the pandemic to crush the backbone of America. I don't agree with that. I don't think the government used the pandemic to crush the backbone being small business. No, they just did two things really, really well, not bad for them, but bad for everyone else. And that is, first of all, they were controlled by politics. Okay, and that swayed their emotions. They probably all thought they were doing the right thing, but they had conflicts of interest. Okay, they also just made a lot of mistakes based on that. But there was a lot of cronyism. They were controlled by the people, the big business, which is the ones that donate the most money, and they have the most influence. Whereas small business people tend to be scattered and independent, and they don't get together and pay off the government, to make special laws, rules, and regulations. So I'm about halfway through, and what she has documented in here, and there's nothing conspiratorial about it, by the way, and that's the only reason why I don't like the subtitle, because it sounds conspiratorial, but it's not. Everything here is what we saw taking place, and if you look at it in retrospect, it's very easy. I mean, she's very fact-based. I mean, she's very good. I don't know if you know Carol Roth or not, but she's spectacular. But I think the subtitle, I don't think that's correct. I'm a big believer in what a mentor of mine, Harry Brown, used to say, and that government does not need a conspiracy to mess things up really bad. They do so just fine without it. Okay. And again, it's because the way the system is as itself, if you study it, which most people don't, again, they listen to their favorite talking heads, whether it's on the left or the right. Okay. And that's where they get their knowledge. But it really isn't necessarily knowledge, at least not complete enough to be, right? And so if we really study it, we see that's just what happens.
Yeah.
So I think we need to be aware, but again, we need to go back to, how much influence on that level do we have? Probably not a whole lot. What we can influence is how we personally respond to what's going on in our lives.
Is it key to persuade the persuadable instead of trying to convert in a world where, when you look at fear gets clicks, fear sells ads, fear gets votes. I mean, if you look on the right and the left, there's fear.
Absolutely.
And we create an enemy, and there are things who, Randy and I talked about this. Randy and I disagree on some issues, and that's fine. That's great.
With them too.
And he'll point to some things and saying, oh, those people don't agree with this because they're based in fear. I'll look at the same thing and say, well, some of these people are saying this and they're based in fear. In a world where you're competing, I guess, with the noise and the fear pornography, is it important to focus on the persuadable versus trying to compete with the noise?
Well, so a lot of times when we're talking, let's say, again, going back to politics, and people think, well, you've got to, persuade the people who are, you got to persuade everybody. No, you don't. No, you have to persuade a certain amount of people. Now, my feeling is, other than in very rare cases, people who are, pretty far to the left and pretty far to the right, they're not really persuadable. And I think the time you take to do that wastes a lot of time in not persuading the people who are a little bit to the left or a little bit to the right, but whose minds are open. And we know there are far more of those. Curt, most people, I believe, want to live in a country where people are basically happy, right? People are basically, when I say basically, I mean at a basic level, a fundamental level, that people are happy, people are healthy, people are able to live their lives however they see fit, providing they don't infringe upon the lives of anyone else, who is trying to do the same. I think most people are like that. Okay. That's the majority of people. They just want to live a good life and let others too. But there are a lot of people who, they may really believe that's what, but they're really fine with telling you, but you can't do this. Right. And again, that's on the left and the right. the further you go out there and the more the more they feel strongly in that way, you're not going to persuade them. Okay. So don't bother. But most people, they just want to know if there's a way you can show them that, yes, you can, live your life, pursue happiness as you see fit, that people are generally going to be, taken care of, that can't help themselves, and who can, they're going to agree with that.
Yeah.
And you can persuade them. Unfortunately, there are a lot of influences out there that are trying to kind of take them in another direction. So yeah, it's a continuous struggle, and it goes back to what you say. So are we participating in that struggle out of fear or out of love? And which, another way of saying, are we participating in it out of weakness or out of strength? And when we do it out of love, it's strength. When we do it out of weakness, it's fear. And fear and weakness are not, very persuasive.
Well, Bob, on that note, I want to thank you for being a beacon of calm, joining us today in a world of fear porn. Thank you for your books, the Go Giver series of books, Adversaries into Allies, huge impact on me, on how I live my life, and on the future. My 15-year-old daughter is reading the books as well. I love them.
Honored to know
Bob,
that.
thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, my brother.